I would like to welcome everybody joining us today in our inspiring series of webinar. So we are hosting our third webinar of the series covering the topic of influencing to end violence against women and girls, best practices and ways forward. My name is Saria Ghazawi. I am the Advocacy Officer at the Regional Gender Justice Program based in Beirut. My colleague Julie Diallo, Gender and Advocacy Advisor, and I will be the moderators of today's session. We would like to thank you and our speakers who have kindly agreed to be part of this exciting discussion. I will give you a short bio of each of our speakers in a bit. I will now be giving a brief introduction and some tips for technical issues and format of the webinar, and then Julie will introduce the series. So first, please turn off and quit Skype in order for Blackboard to work properly. Close all similar programs. This will minimize the risk of your computer struggling to run the webinar software. You will not need a microphone for today's session. Please click on Tools and run your audio setup wizard. Configure your headphones to be able to hear. The moderators and speakers will be the only ones speaking to avoid any technical issues and background noise. If you face any technical issues, please click on my name, Saria Ghazawi, and type your question in a private box. This will send me a private message. If you wish to write something for everybody to see, please use the main room. The session is being recorded and it will be posted online. It will then be interpreted into Arabic. We apologize in advance for voice delays, cuts due to low internet connection. Please bear with us as this is something that cannot be much controlled. It might also take time for you to see the slides. You can use the smiley feature right under your name to express your emotion and feeling during a presentation. We will ask you to click on the applause button after each presentation as a thank you to our speakers. You can try it out now if you would like. The Q&A session. For the Q&A session, we have chosen to open the floor for a question, 5 minutes following each presentation, and leave the remaining time for general question after the 3 presentations are done. Feel free to type your questions in Arabic or French if you feel more comfortable. As we have participants from various regions that have plenty of knowledge, we would like to give the floor to any participant that would like to share his or her experience at the end. You can do that through the raise hand button, which is the third icon under your name, and we will give you microphone rights. Welcome newcomers. We are now still in the introduction. With each webinar, our aim is to enhance and improve our moderation and provide you with a smooth and interesting experience. For this, we have created a very short survey that we will share with you at the very end. We would be grateful if you could share with us any feedback you might have. That's about it for general introduction. Julie will now move on to introducing us and what our program is all about.
Thank you, Saria. Hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Julie, and with my colleague Saria, we are very excited to launch the 3rd edition of our inspiring series of webinar on gender justice. And we are also very, very happy that such interesting speakers from Lebanon and Thailand join us today. Thank you very much to you. Just to tell you a little bit about us, the Regional Gender Justice Program. The Oxfam Regional Gender Justice Program in Middle East and North Africa, along with partners, works across aspects of government that can most readily and sustainably accelerate progress toward gender justice. We work with individuals, communities, decision and opinion makers to call for change in attitude and belief about gender relation and for improved system of accountability for gender equality and women's rights. And this is exactly what we'll be discussing today in this webinar. With this inspiring series of webinars on gender justice, we wish to create an interactive space that brings together conceptual thinking and practical examples of advancing gender justice and women's rights. We really hope you get inspired, you find it interesting, and that our discussion would create opportunities for future collaboration and join regional and transnational advocacy for gender justice and women's rights. So now I will give the floor to Saria, who will be introducing today's topic, as well as the speaker. Saria, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Julie. As we all know, today we are talking about a very sensitive topic that have affected us in one way or another. We might have witnessed it, we might have lived it, we might have helped someone who has survived it. It is something that affects most, if not all, women in the world in one way or another. So we are talking about violence against women and girls that takes many forms and affects the victims on many levels, ranging from physical to emotional and psychological. Let us remind ourselves that 1 out of 3 women in the world has been subjected to some type of violence. Although this killer fact has been shared and heard a lot, it does not get any less alarming. So today we have chosen to talk about this issue and discuss the influencing strategies that have been done on the global level in Asia as well as in the Middle East and North African region, specifically in Lebanon. The objective of this webinar is to share experiences on these strategies, on the strategies used to influence social norms and behaviors and policy. We will focus on lessons learned and best practices and discuss ways forward. So now we will be moving to introducing our speakers. The first speakers who will present today is Dr. Lina Rafeh. Dr. Rafeh brings nearly 20 years of experience addressing gender issues in both development and humanitarian settings. Her focus is on gender-based violence in emergency settings, conflict, post-conflict, and natural disasters. She has worked with many UN agencies and international NGOs in countries such as Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Lebanon, Nepal, Papua New Guinea, and many others. Dr. Rafeh completed her PhD in 2008 under the auspices of the London School of Economics and Political Science Department of International Development, researching the effects of gender-focused international aid in conflict and post-conflict contexts. We will share all resources that I have mentioned and some links to check out the work now in the chat. Julie is sharing them now in the chat room. So moving on to our next speaker. The second presenter today is Mehta. Mona works with Oxfam in Asia as the Regional Manager for Gender Equality Knowledge Network. She has been working on the issue of gender equality and women's rights for the past 3 decades. And one of the key works that she has been involved in is the We Can End All Violence Against Women campaign, the We Can campaign, that started in South Asia and spread to 16 countries across the world. Our third presenter is Maya Ammar. She's a women's rights activist and writer from Lebanon. She holds a master's degree in communication studies from St. Joseph University. She is the media and communications coordinator in KAFA, Enough Violence and Exploitation, a feminist organization working on eradicating violence against women in Lebanon since 2005. She coordinates media and advocacy-related campaigns for KAFA's programs on family violence, trafficking in women, and child protections from gender-based violence. Apologies if this intro took a bit long than expected. I will now give the floor to Dr. Lina Rafeh, who will talk to us about global guidance and good practices on ending violence against women and girls. Dr. Lina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Faria and everybody. I'm delighted to be speaking to you today. I'll start with some global perspective. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll start with a question. And that is, what's in a name? We talk about violence against women and girls, all of the acronyms that surround this discourse, GBV, SGBV, CRSV, CRSGBV, those are quite a few acronyms. Are we referring to the same thing? Does it matter? Yes, it does. Actually, it matters quite a bit. We can't use these terms interchangeably. There are different meanings that are attached to each, and as a result, different programmatic and funding implications attached to each of these acronyms. So we can't afford to be careless. We have to actually be quite conscious and make a choice when we are referring to one of these terms that we know what we say and we're doing what we say. For instance, When we speak about violence against women, VAW, we actually tend to mean, by default, violence against women and girls. But in addition to that, we also mean adolescent girls, the elderly, the female fetus as well. So there is violence that happens to females even pre-birth. So the idea is maybe we need to refer to a VAF, violence against females. Maybe we need to refer to something else. The reality is that our discourse is fragmented. When we talk about GBV, gender-based violence, for instance, that implies we're working also with male survivors. Are we? We can't say it if we're not doing it. In addition, what about the spectrum of sexual orientations and gender identities? Do we address those? And then we talk about something like conflict-related sexual violence. And we speak to a woman in the context of conflicts, for example, in the Central African Republic, who says, well, I was raped, the perpetrator was my neighbor, but it wouldn't have happened if there was no conflict. Is that conflict-related sexual violence or not? So we need to rethink and redefine our language. But for these purposes, I'm going to use GBV, just to pick one acronym. Next slide, please. So definitions and types. You've heard already that 1 in 3 women and girls worldwide will be affected. This is something we know, we hear frequently. There are many forms, and intimate partner violence actually is the most common of those. But does our funding, does our programming reflect this? And I leave that out there as a question. And there's also another question I'd like to put to all of you. It is how people actually understand what is violence. We're reading a lot about young women, for instance, in the US or in European countries who are coerced into sex, but they don't consider that to be rape. Or women harassed on the street that don't view harassment as violence. So what do all those things mean, and how do we at least create this awareness around the different forms that are not physical? For instance, street harassment reduces women's mobility, narrows their space, their choices, their voices. So this is something that definitely is violence, but most people, well, many people might not see it as such. So it's incumbent upon us then to raise that kind of awareness. Some types of violence have more focus and therefore more funding. So conflict-related sexual violence right now, something we hear about. And when we do this, we actually, as practitioners, as activists, those who are on the front lines, are placing a value on which form of violence is more important for the women who are experiencing it. So that's something that also we need to think about. Next slide. There is a global imperative to do this work. From CEDAW in '79 to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, there's a lot of guidance. 1993, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995, and then a lot around the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and the subsequent resolutions that are reinforcing the Women, Peace, and Security mandate and agenda. There are also global commitments like the call to action on protection from GBV in emergencies and the roadmap that is 2016 to 2020. This is an operational framework that is multinational and has a global focus and rotating leadership. So this is actually a great example of something that could potentially be the way forward for all of us. We now have the World Humanitarian Summit coming up in a few weeks in Istanbul, where GBV is definitely going to be a topic. And we have global movements and activism. You all know about 16 Days, Orange the World, and so on. The unity of focus and the messaging here is important. And we retain, obviously, the ability to interpret these differently in our context, in our countries, and our communities. That's critical. Now, what is great about these movements is the awareness raising, the funding it generates, information. And if we're to examine the successes of these, we have to do that not necessarily at the global level, but in the respective contexts in which we work. Because to see that kind of change needs more time, needs us to conduct a bigger study, isolate the other factors that often cause a resurgence in violence against women, even if it seems like things are improving because of these campaigns. So while we can orange the world and wear our orange t-shirts, this is just one part of a much larger effort. Next slide. Globally, for the most part, there's agreement on what we're supposed to do. for gender-based violence, to prevent it, to respond to it, coordinate around it, to inform people of it, and then how we do it. Approaches that are based on rights, that are survivor-centered, that are community-based, as well as the guiding principles: safety, confidentiality, respect, non-discrimination. Those things, I think, by now are the non-negotiables. Next slide. In terms of prevention, these are the actions that stop gender-based violence from occurring in the first place. Prevention and mitigation both. These need longer-term investment and, again, context. Things like support for livelihoods, safe access to cooking fuel, food security, safe access to water and sanitation, safe shelter. I assume you're seeing the theme here. Safety is a very big theme. Things like education, women in leadership, engaging men and boys, working with security actors, advocacy for policy change and behavior change. And then when we talk about prevention and behavior change, we have to ask ourselves, what are the arguments that are working? We had a wave of arguments around she's your mother, she's your sister, etc. Did that work? We've had arguments around violence costs the state. What is the cost of violence against women? The economic argument, is that working? Next slide is about response. This is the multi-sectoral response. So all of the different actors that are involved, as you know, health, counseling, and psychosocial support, and so on, and ideally case management that links all of these together. So again, we have to ask ourselves, what are the weakest links here? What are the cultural norms and practices, the stigma around this, the context of patriarchy, and so on? What are the human and financial resources we have to bring this to fruition? What is the level of coordination or lack thereof? And what does this mean for areas that are maybe harder to reach, rural, remote areas, and so on? And finally, something that plagues us, that pains me, is the fragmented nature of local groups. There's a lot of territorial behavior that comes at the expense of survivor support. Next slide. If we are to support survivors, the referral pathway is the best way to do it. If we do one thing, this is it. It's the network of support services for survivors and the pathway that you see on the screen that helps survivors to access those services. Next slide. In terms of programming, mainstreaming, and coordination, programming is a direct service delivery. And I'm going to show pictures on the right of tools that are based on global guidance that are created for emergency contexts but can be applied to non-emergencies. We have a great deal of tools for emergencies because there's a global coordination mechanism that exists to create and endorse these. That's the gender-based violence area of responsibility. So when we talk about mainstreaming, for instance, everyone has to do it in principle. So then who does it? No one will do it. It's very challenging. There's a need to find strategic entry points. As an example, from my work in Papua New Guinea, we used the HIV response and HIV programming as an entry point for gender-based violence to help us advance both prevention and response. In terms of coordination, we talk about coordination in times of emergency, but why not do that in times of non-emergency as well? For instance, my work in Mauritania, I was very impressed by the commitment to strengthen the coordination mechanism and maintain it as a permanent structure. So building local leadership, buy-in of government, without creating a parallel coordination mechanism. That is one of our biggest flaws. It undermines local structures. It is an obvious failure to coordinate because anyway, a coordination mechanism is only as strong as its members. Next slide. We also have a collective obsession with numbers. How many survivors? This is a little bit dangerous. There is guidance for this, ethical and safety recommendations for how to research, document, and monitor gender-based violence. In this case, this is the WHO guidance on sexual violence in emergencies. We also have a gender-based violence information management system for quantitative data. This is for emergencies, but can be adapted as well. The challenge is that we need to focus on the services first and not the numbers, because the numbers are always going to underestimate the reality, absolutely everywhere. Next slide. Standard operating procedures are agreements among organizations on who does what. Creating this kind of agreement is consensus building, and therefore it's also capacity building. So doing this and agreeing on minimum standards is critical, and for me, one of my favorite points of good practice. Next. When we talk about emergencies, what's different? The fact is that emergency and non-emergency services are not the same. The types are different, so sexual violence is much more prominent, more immediate and more dangerous, trafficking, forced prostitution, sexual exploitation and abuse. Emergencies tend to have more funding, more staff, and yet that funding is insufficient. For instance, in 2014, only 1% of the funding for fragile states went towards women's groups or women's ministries. So if we're not investing in those local sustainable structures, who are we investing in? We need to commit to building capacity over the long haul. And then after the emergency, what happens? Are those gains sustained? Where does the money go? The fact is that short-term funding and focus creates a void. So we need to switch to longer term because we know there is a continuum of violence. And we know that for women and for girls, the violence doesn't end when the emergency ends. Next slide, please. In emergencies, we say that we have a duty to respond, to reduce risk, to promote resilience, to aid recovery. Do we have that similar duty, that obligation in non-emergencies? Do we feel that? Is there that shared mandate? And if not, why not? Next. In emergencies, we're told to assume that GBV is taking place, regardless of the presence or absence of concrete evidence. And this is integrated throughout the humanitarian program cycle. We know that GBV happens everywhere, that it's underreported everywhere. In emergencies, it is magnified. So GBV actions are integrated throughout this cycle. And when we talk about something like preparedness on the outside of the cycle, if we are not responding, we should be preparing at all times. Preparedness is our continuous state. We need, at the same time, to prioritize recovery over the long term to look at livelihoods, living conditions, restoring services, and ensuring sustainability of GBV interventions that are taken to scale in an emergency. Next slide. Conflict and disaster. We hear a lot about rape as a weapon of war. So we know what this does to women, but in terms of populations and communities, this is a total breakdown. We know that the nature of war has changed and that most of the fatalities are civilians, women and children, and many of those fatalities come from GBV. In disasters, disasters are just as challenging for women. In fact, natural disasters have killed more women than men because of their restricted mobility, because of sociocultural norms. The tsunami, for instance, Sri Lanka, the death rate of women was much higher than that of men in some communities. And they face the risk of increased sexual physical violence in the aftermath. So DRR, disaster risk reduction, is a movement that clarifies what we are supposed to do to support, to prevent, to reduce risk. And GBV entry points are integrated in every aspect of this. For example, in Haiti following the earthquake, the demand for safe spaces and shelters, livelihood services, participation in the recovery process, and a voice in the process. Those were critical demands made by women. Next slide. And I always talk about context and agency because none of this will work without an understanding of the context and respect for women's agency. We're talking about sustainable stuff, social change. It takes time. So we should be in it for the long haul or not at all. We talk about this classic feminist adage, nothing about us without us. We need a seat at the table. Or, in fact, we risk failure or backlash. We saw in Afghanistan a backlash because of the created perception that gender equality was part of an imported and imposed agenda. One good example of respecting context and agency would come from Uganda. There are many others, but raising voices, real community investment and engagement that worked with both women and men. So that's longer-term capacity building, local capacity, addressing local issues. One-off trainings are not enough. Next slide, please. Holistic support, so the idea of one-stop, medical care, psychosocial, economic opportunity, basic living skills. A good example comes from Sierra Leone, the Rainbow Centers that were one-stop shops co-located with a hospital, named in a way that was comfortable, non-stigmatizing, embedded in the communities. Next slide. Economic empowerment is one of those that I believe in very strongly as a prevention, as a response, for gender-based violence, but also carries with it great risk, because we've learned lessons that show that we need to combine economic programming with gender-focused work on male family members, that's partners and whatever, that help us to negotiate household finances and build equality at the household level. Because if we don't do that, again, there's a backlash. And if we don't provide immediate economic support for women, there are great risks as well in terms of the increase in sexual exploitation and abuse. Women have to engage in more difficult, more risky work that is farther to get to in unsafe areas, transactional sex, trafficking, prostitution. Women are rendered more vulnerable in those situations. So in emergencies or not, economic support should be part of our core package, our immediate response. Next, please. Engaging men, something that we talk about quite a bit. What you see here is the progression of how we have thought through our engagement with men. So do we work with women and girls? Indeed we do. Are we working with men and boys? Yes, we are, to a certain extent. There are movements that do that as well. Are we working with women and men together in terms of fostering respectful and nonviolent relationships? Not as much. So why is this all important? Embedding these approaches in the family, in the community, offering equal economic opportunity, for instance, working on women without marginalizing men, appealing to male leaders, gatekeepers, etc. This is something that could advance us without taking the focus away from women and girls. Next slide, please. In terms of the global challenges, these are many. And there are recommendations that I'm sure we all have in terms of longer-term funding, like I've said, to manage the cyclical nature of violence and the likely resurgence of violence against women, the local capacity in terms of not a one-off training, but longer-term support, looking at not just country and community perspectives, but also regional perspectives, because there is a cross-border element to gender-based violence. For instance, trafficking is an example of a form of violence that crosses a border. We need to build strong coordination mechanisms before an emergency. And we need to ensure holistic approaches, as I mentioned, that integrate multiple types of services and support. And finally, we don't talk about this often enough, but for those on the front lines, we need self-care and to prioritize our own safety and security. This is something that gets sidelined very quickly and something that should remain on our agendas, because if we're not helping ourselves, we're not able to help or reach anybody else. So with that, I will end, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you. Saria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lina. Really, please, a round of applause for Dr. Lina. Thanks a lot for that really, really good presentation, really providing you an overview, a shaking presentation about pushing us to rethink our approach, rethink the terminology that we use, and with really practical examples from different region and different country. So thank you very much. Now, as Saria said, we will open 5 minutes for questions for Dr. Lina. So please feel free to write your question in the chat box, and we'll take 5 minutes to address those questions. So please, if you have any question, write them in the chat box. Thank you. So what I will do is that I will start with my question in the time that people can, participants can write some question on the chat box. My question, Dr. Lina, it will be about the self-care, because this is actually something that we discuss quite a lot on how we, as our partner, we support our partner in terms of self-care, because they are very often in situations at risk. And so what can we do? What are the good example or good strategy that you have seen that can inspire us and we can replicate? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. This is a great question. As I said, it's one we don't address often enough. I think self-care and safety and security need to be institutionalized from the very beginning with all of these organizations, addressed to the staff, and addressed in a way that destigmatizes this, that doesn't make people feel like they are weak if they're not able to handle it. I think we hear this quite often, especially in humanitarian contexts. Oh, you should be tough, you know, this is the field, it's all right. But that is dismissing it, and it's actually quite dangerous. So it's incumbent upon the organization to provide opportunities for outlets, recreation, R&R, obviously a therapist if somebody needs to speak to a professional, group kind of time to unwind, and in addition, mechanisms to report any incidents of safety and security. We've been hearing quite a lot about survivors of sexual violence and those that are humanitarian aid workers, I'm speaking in the humanitarian context specifically, that have experienced some form of sexual violence that has been dismissed by the agencies that they work for. That for me is also a very dangerous trend, that we're not able or comfortable to report the abuse that we experience, and we're putting ourselves in grave risk to do the work that we do, and that shouldn't be a part of our gender-based violence support. So I think what we need is to make it clear that the organization is willing to support, will take these issues on, will not penalize, reprimand, marginalize the staff person in any way, but in fact will fully support them throughout the process. I could continue, but I'll stop here in case there are other questions, and we can go on about self-care if anybody would like. Julie, to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your response. It's really complete. So we'll take note and try to make that happen. So thank you. I have another question about you mentioned territorial behavior in relation to VAW. So I wanted to know if you could unpack a little bit on that.
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the things that makes me the most despondent in the field, to be honest. It is where agency positioning and branding tends to hijack what is, I think, the greater goal that we share, support for survivors and prevention of gender-based violence. This is where issues of who is doing what, who is doing the work is more important than the work, than the what that they're actually doing. And it's very difficult, in fact, to bridge those kinds of divides. I've seen it in just about every country where I've worked, where when some agencies disagree, they are just fundamentally unable to see the greater good, the bigger picture, the shared goal. And how to overcome that, I would love some ideas from everybody else, because we really try to work very hard. And now that I'm embedded in an academic institute that works on these issues, but also is at the intersection, as I say, of academia and activism, it's an interesting and neutral position to mediate those kinds of things. And I wonder what kind of role going forward that we can play in bridging those divides. But I think what I would say is a reminder to all of us, especially as we go through these processes of coordination, of coming up with shared ways forward, standard operating procedures, for instance, referral mechanisms, that we are working towards the same thing. In the end, the what is more important than the who. Any other questions? Oh, I see a question here. Shall I go ahead and answer?
Yes,
okay,
please.
I see. Okay, the role of advocacy. Oh, this is a very interesting question. Okay, there is a role for advocacy, absolutely, and I think that's advocacy. I define that very broadly at all levels. So there is advocacy at the community, at the local level. There are campaigns that use maybe role models or contextual kind of messaging. Maybe that is through more positive kind of theater, music, comics. We're seeing lots of use of that. Sports personalities. Those kinds of approaches I think are fantastic. They're really interesting. Edutainment kind of stuff. I am very much in favor. Those really need to be contextual embedded, community-based, long-term, and very well resourced. It is tricky for many of us who struggle to manage a response to be able to commit the time, the resources to do something like this over the long term. But I wish that we could. And I wish that we could do this together, not just all of us that work in the nonprofit world, but also combine forces with private companies, film production companies, radio, whatever, theater. I've seen interesting work being done with clowns and clowning and social messaging in Afghanistan. We've seen a lot of this like soap opera style come out of South Africa. We've seen lots of really innovative and positive approaches, and I think those are really a great tactic. This is not about reprimanding or blaming or pointing fingers. This is about engaging people in what is a community and collective responsibility to prevent all forms of violence, to end this cycle, to end violent societies overall, specifically gender-based violence. So I think the risk is that, well, the benefits are great, obviously. I think they're very engaging. The risk is that if we don't sustain it, if we don't do it well, and if we don't do it over the long haul, also including community interaction, building in a kind of feedback loop so we can gauge how people are receiving these kinds of communications and campaigns, how people see this marketing. Is it working or not? How we can adjust. Again, long-term stuff. But there are not a lot of donors that will help us to do this. There are not a lot of donors that help us fund those kinds of things. And so I have to wonder, where are the organizations, the big donors that are committed to funding these things over the long haul to help us to really achieve something in terms of prevention? I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Julie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lina. Really, I think it's really answered the question. But also, just to remind the participant that at the end of the third presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So please feel free to direct other questions to Dr. Lina. So thank you very much, Dr. Lina. So now I would like to introduce Mona. Mona, who is the Oxfam Regional Manager for Gender Equality Knowledge Network in Asia, and she is based in India. And Mona will share with us some good practice and lessons learned from the weekend campaign. Mona, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? I'm assuming that you can hear me. Yes, that's great. So thank you very much, and I'm really happy to be here and talking about weekend. And the period that I'm going to be talking about is from 2004 to 2011. This was a campaign that I was involved in 7 years of my life, practically all my time, so it is very close to my heart. So talking about it a bit in the past, but at the same time it still carries on in a number of countries, so it also exists now, but I have less involvement in it. What was weekend? And just taking from the earlier speaker, I think it's absolutely critical that we are doing a lot more, and of course grappling with the same issues of how do we find donors who are willing to look at it for the long haul. Oxfam did in 2004 kind of recognize that we've been doing a lot of supporting a lot of programs on the ground, but we could make changes in pockets, but how do we kind of have a bigger impact? And that's kind of where weekend came up, the idea of weekend and the support for weekend from within Oxfam initially, to want to do something at scale. And it was not focusing on advocacy, it was not focusing on changing policies, but focusing really on how do we actually change social norms, how do we actually change attitudes and behaviors. So that was really the challenge, and that's kind of what weekend was about, addressing social norms that support and perpetuate violence against women and girls. Now, it was a campaign where we started with a very ambitious target of 50 million people. We wanted to reach 50 million people. I mean, in Asia, 50 million is not a large number, as you can imagine, in South Asia, with India having a billion-plus population. But it was big for Oxfam and big for our partners to think about. And we said we'd do that through mobilizing 5 million change makers who would each reach out to 10 other people. By 2011, 7 years down the line, we had reached something like 4.7 million change makers. What were change makers? Change makers essentially were ordinary people, men, women, girls, boys, anyone essentially who was willing to change themselves and reach out to other people and influence them. And what was the change about? So they focused on personal change. This was one of the key features of WeCan, that you first changed yourself. You changed your attitudes and behavior that perpetuated gender equality or violence against women. Remember, this was focusing on prevention. The critical part of WeCan had to be that we had to make this a problem that everybody felt could be theirs. So I had to feel that this was my problem. I had to be able to link to it and therefore then want to take action. So that was our first critical issue and key feature of WeCan, to make it something that everybody could relate to. We focused on domestic violence because we felt that was the most common form of violence. We focus on everyday domestic violence, not just the acute expressions of violence. We also recognize that, you look at it and you say, oh, there are 100 million women missing in Asia. It seems like a huge problem. It seems, what could I do about that? It seems impossible. So how do you break it down? How do you make it something that I can feel I can do something about, so that I can sign up and I can say, okay, by doing this, by taking these actions, I can bring change. And that's where the second part, which is about that you can make change. Each one of us can make change in our circle of influence, not kind of going out on the streets or not going and talking to strangers, but within our circles of influence. And so that's kind of what we asked change makers to reach out to people they knew and to try and bring change over there. The last was, of course, it was about institutions, so it's a personal change. But we recognize that many times we have laws and then you have duty bearers who, because of their own biases, do not implement laws. And so that's what we wanted to reach to individuals within institutions, to sort of say that we can, through committed individuals working in institutions whose own biases we are addressing, then therefore become much more willing to implement the policies and laws. But the most critical institution that we can really address was the family. It's one of the least organized, the most difficult to get to, because there is no structure in a sense. There's no high, kind of structure, state structure through which you can actually get it. Yes, there are laws, but a lot of things happen outside of that. And so that's kind of where our change makers really worked at, because it was about their own lives and about reaching to other people around them. So those were the kind of key features of WeCan. The next slide, please. This was about how did the campaign go? Over 7 years. We started in 2004 till 2011. These are the numbers that from 6 countries where we started. We reached 16 countries across 4 continents. The last 2 countries, in fact, happened post 2011, therefore they're not in this list. That's Singapore and Caracas. And we reached about 4.7 million change makers, which now looks, when looking back, feels, yeah, okay, still not big enough. But when we were starting at 0 in 2004, it seemed an enormous target to have. And I think yes, we can sort of feel good that we did get close to the 5 million we wanted to. And in terms of the critical part, we didn't do this alone. We couldn't possibly have done this alone. Oxfam initiated the campaign, but it was an alliance-led campaign, and we started with our partners in 2004, people who were willing to kind of, embark on this somewhat crazy idea at that point. And from 100-odd partners of Oxfam who trusted us, who worked with us, to more than 5,000 alliance members across these countries. So that's kind of a very critical factor, that you need to work with others. You need to engage a wide range of people. We always look for, institutions and others who could, networks who actually had an outreach, whose constituency, in a sense, we can piggyback onto their work. They took it into their own work that they were doing, whether it was youth networks, whether it was colleges, whether it was schools. We actually linked up and, used those. The next slide, please. And so what were the lessons learned? I mean, looking back, it's been quite some years. One is that I still believe it's absolutely critical that when we mobilize change makers, the inner change is the first step. And that's kind of absolutely critical for a change, for them to be effective, for change to really happen. Because it's easy to tell others that they should change. It's about changing your own attitudes, your biases that are often the most difficult, and to sustain that. Our best change makers were people who started with their own change. Also, when you start with your own change, you see the benefits, you feel the benefits, and therefore you're convinced, and therefore you are convincing to others. And also there is a self-propelled process because you benefited. You don't need somebody to keep pushing you. The second key lesson learned is that it's absolutely critical that we are not going with prescriptive messages, that we are really talking about enabling people to think for themselves, to kind of decide and to make up their own minds, but also then to act. So it's about a positive approach. So you're not blaming, you're not pointing fingers, but you're actually raising that this is violence. So for us, it was very much of bringing to people's notice that the actions that were happening are violence. We also assume that in our society, violence is still not something that's really acceptable. But also then enabling and allowing people to kind of think what actions would they take. And this was also very important because when you're talking about women, many of them experiencing violence, the actions that they can take need to be something that they can live with. There's a huge issue of risk. We didn't want to put people at risk unnecessarily, but also allowing people to decide the pace of change and the direction of the change that they want, rather than having something which is externally kind of imposed that this is the right change. Thirdly, it's about having high quality learning materials, communication materials. Communication was the core of VCAN. We spent over 1/3 of our total budget on communication materials. These were materials in print and in audio visual formats that actually went into the hands of our change makers. Because this was also another key feature of the campaign, that yes, we had 5,000 plus alliance members, but they were more or less a means to reach change makers. The core people bringing change were our change makers, and for them to have materials in their hands that they could for themselves to learn as well as to use to influence others. And this, I think, was an absolutely critical factor for the success of VCAN. And I don't think you can get away from it. It was also not something that we had right from the beginning. We started with materials which we learned from others, but then we evolved, and there we used a lot of experiences from change makers, their stories of change. So we moved from defining the problem to actually talking about what can you be doing about it. And these were where the stories of our change makers really came into use in our materials. The other factor was about saying that we needed that when we mobilize change makers, it's not a one-off engagement. We recognize that our best change happened when change makers had multiple engagements. So they were we were in touch with them periodically, and that's was another critical factor when we evaluated that we recognize deeper change requires multiple engagement. Over time. And then it's about the momentum, having a campaign. Each of the change makers knew that they were part of this huge campaign, that they were not alone. And this was absolutely critical because one of the main reasons why violence continues is because people feel isolated, because people feel they cannot speak out, because people feel that they cannot act. Both the people who are experiencing violence, but also people who witness violence. And so to break that silence, break that sense of isolation, to be part of this bigger movement, and that was absolutely critical for VCAN's success. Adapting I also, we had a lot of our materials, we developed centrally the ideas, the core messages, but also the approach. There were principles that we kind of developed, but then when it came to implementation and our 5,000 odd alliance members who were very diverse, we let them implement the way that worked for them. So you can't expect a school to be working the same way as an NGO. How they will be able to take weekend forward would be very different, and maybe that's where the adaptation became quite critical. Also across countries, and across continents, we allowed people to adapt as long as we had those core principles that we maintained. We also, when we talk about how did this campaign work, 7 years, managing it, huge budget, etc., raising funds, the whole works, there was a core team. A fair bit of that team was from Oxfam, but also from our alliance members. But what was very critical is that executive leadership did not really have a public face. The public leadership was always with the alliance. They were the people who were actually mobilizing. They were the people who were communicating in their spheres of influence, in their areas, geographies, and they were the public leadership. So this division was very critical because Oxfam, it was about WeCan, and all the alliance members in a way subsumed their identity to creating the identity of WeCan and the identity of change makers. So those became the identities that were really visible, that was really that created that momentum, but allowed a very diverse range of organizations to come together. So these were some of the core lessons learned. I'm sure there are more. Just to kind of end, I would say that yes, 7 years seems a long time, but 7 years was just, for many people, the beginning. The WeCan campaign continues in a number of countries, Bangladesh being one of the core examples where not only is it continuing but thriving. So I think it's about saying what are the next phase and how does one continue with something that one has set up. Okay, over to you, Saria.
Thank you, Mona, for this very interesting presentation on successful influencing from the WeCan campaign. Please, everybody, join me with a round of applause. Thank you. So now we will move to the Q&A with the questions that are related to the presentation. We have a first question, which is, what are the key elements of the sustainability of the WeCan campaign? Over to you, Mona.
Yeah, I think one of the core things, and I'd like to talk about it, is or differentiate between sustainability of WeCan and sustainability of the change. And I think I'll explain why, because I think sustainability of WeCan, and in 2011, that's kind of what we recognized, that, we had created this enormous kind of a campaign, with 5,000 alliance members. I mean, this huge kind of structure almost. Sustaining that it requires huge resources also. But what was core to WeCan was our change makers. These change makers were not always looking back to saying, so what should we do? They weren't looking to the campaign for their clues. They had kind of taken that change, made it, taken the issue, made it their own, and were doing their change in their own lives and in lives of people around them. So when I talk about sustainability of the change, I think sustainability of change happens because our WeCan change makers are still there, out there doing things and making change and living the change in their own lives. Sustainability of WeCan as a campaign was much more complex, and what happened in a way was that in some of the countries where the alliance continued with that, wanted to continue with that, and have been able to generate resources, it has certainly carried on. Bangladesh, as I said, was a very good example. In other countries, it was much more difficult to sustain the structure, to raise the resources to continue with this. And so what's happened is that alliance members have taken it into their own work. So there isn't a central kind of a campaign still going on, but BCAN continues in many ways within the work that our alliance are doing, because that's kind of where they had linked it.
Thank you, Mona. We have another question. What lessons from the WeCan do you think are most relevant to the new Oxfam Violence Against Women campaign? What can we learn and what should we avoid?
Ooh, big question. I think, and I was recently speaking about this to somebody, I think one is that you have to, so yes, I think core was that you have to stick your neck out, sort of make a choice. You can't sort of focus on everything and say we'll kind of, the campaign will be a sum of many, many different bits and pieces. Campaigns require a compelling vision, a compelling kind of focus to generate the momentum, to build that cohesion. And I think that's absolutely critical. So sticking your neck out, to making a choice and saying this is what we are really going to try and go for. Being a bit crazy, as I said, 5 million change makers, 50 million people sounded quite mad when we started in 2004. When we had totaled up the people we were reaching in via Oxfam, it was just a few thousand, maybe a few 100,000 when we talked about indirect. So it was a huge thing to think about. But to say that no, this is something we want to aim for because we need the change. So that's another part that you have to have. The third is about creating a team and building, so building from the ground, but at the same time with having this cohesive vision and building a team that sticks to it. You can't keep having people coming and going if you want a campaign that will kind of have an impact.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mona. Any other questions? No, I think we can move on to our last presentation.
Can I just add one more point?
Of course.
When we talk about the new campaign, resources. You can't. I mean, you need resources. However, with the best will in the world and all the passion and the commitment, without resources, it's not possible. And I think that's one of the biggest blocks that we are facing right now. So yes, it doesn't mean always huge resources, but resources that we are willing to commit. I mean, Oxfam GB committed to WeCan, and other Oxfams also supported that. We raised money afterwards, so that by the end of the campaign, we were maybe 10% of Oxfam and 90% from other donors. But when we started, it was the other way around. So that's kind of absolutely critical. We need to be able to invest.
Thank you, Mona. We do have one other question, which is, did the WeCan campaign partner with the private sector?
I don't think we had any major partnerships with the private sector in the period till 2011. And we did have post that some partnership with the media. So if you consider media as private sector, we have had some partnerships, not in terms of actually, but in terms of having talk shows and things like that, which we could link up on. So that's been mostly the experience. I don't think we've had major sort of partner, because one of the biggest problems was that the companies would need to be able to stand up for what WeCan was talking about, and that was about your own personal commitment. How do you ensure that that was something, that a company would stand to scrutiny? As much as celebrities also whom we could engage, would they stand up to scrutiny? Would they be willing to speak about their own biases, their own attitudes, their own behavior? So that was one of our always a big question mark. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation and thank you for your questions. So 4.7 million changemaker is really a great number. So we have learned that the change should start within, and it is when the change starts within you that you become convincing, and it is easier to convince others with positive messaging. So thank you for these great points, Mona. So we will now move to our last presentation. I will now give the floor to Maya Ammar, who will talk to us about KAFA's influencing strategies and successful practices that have led to changes in policy and social norms. Over to you, Maya.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Maya.
Okay, so thank you for having me, and I would like first to go through a general overview about KAFA. So next, please. So we are a feminist organization based in Lebanon, and we envision a society that is free of structures that discriminate against women. And we've been working on eradicating violence against women since 2005. And we use a combination of approaches in our work, and I think the two speakers before me mentioned a lot of these approaches and tools, namely advocacy for law reform, working on altering public opinion practices. We conduct research and training and work on empowering women and children victims of violence through direct support, different activities, and services. Our main programs are on family violence, exploitation, and trafficking in women, especially in migrant domestic workers and women in prostitution, who are the groups that are vulnerable to trafficking in Lebanon, and child protection, particularly from gender-based violence. So I will talk about some practical things we worked on in a specific campaign about family violence, which was one of KAFA's focal points for the last, let's say, 7 years. Next slide, please. And so to discuss this campaign and how we worked on it, what tools we used, I'm going to divide the time frame into two. The first one is before the approval of the law on family violence in Lebanon. It was approved in 2014. So the main objective was to legislate the law. And the second period of time is objective 2, which is the present objective after the approval of the law, is namely to increase knowledge about this law, ensure an effective implementation of its content, and advocate to amend it as well, because they did not approve it the way we wished that they would. And next, please. So when we were working on legislating the law to protect women from family violence, we always kept in mind that even if the law was not legislated, even if it was not approved by Parliament, we still did a lot of work, and many things did change indeed, because in parallel with the advocacy work, with the lobbying work on the law, the discussion was happening. There was a debate going on in the society. A lot of work was being done on attitude and behavior and practices as well. And the topic was not very much discussed like 8 years ago. So I think there was indeed a change that happened, because people were more aware about family violence, and the issue was taken more seriously. Now, if I want to talk a little bit about how we worked, and what tactics we used, I will focus on the communication strategy that KAFA adopted. So first, we wanted to introduce the topic to the public. So at the very first stage, we did collaborate with celebrities, maybe to bring attention. But now, for example, we don't feel the need to do it anymore. We produced different materials, of course, and did diverse actions, awareness sessions, forum theater, interactive theater, discussions, and we also worked with men and boys, but mainly to work on the issue of masculinities and how they relate to it and how they are framed, of course, and how their masculinities are affecting violence against women. The second thing, which I think is very important, is when we talk about law, it's it can be a very difficult language and like a legal jargon for the public. So we really wanted to make things accessible. This talk about parliament, committees, laws, agendas, we wanted people to understand it more clearly and also be on the same wave with KAFA. So we were constantly updating the public on the status of the law after we presented it to the cabinet. The third thing, of course, was documenting the information and visualizing. In Lebanon, we hear a lot of people say, well, we don't have such cases. No, it exists in other societies, or no, in other religious sects. Our sect is perfectly fine and treats women very well. So documentation and visualization actually helps people see it with their eyes, that it does exist, and it exists in all regions and among all religious sects as well. And all this was done by working also closely with the media. We created a pool of journalists that are allies to the cause, and not just to KAFA and to come and cover events. And this was not the type of relationship we wanted to build with the media. So forming a pool of journalists was very important, because they are actually committed to the cause, and they work on it wholeheartedly and willingly. And they help us have information, and we help them also have the information they need. Now, other interesting tactics that we used while working on legislating for this law was the name and shame. Name and shame, I think it worked a lot because it exposed the practices of the MPs who were studying the law between 2011 and 2013, and we actually disclosed the discussions that were happening among the members of this committee. They were actually distorting the content of the law. And so we played on their image, we exposed their pictures, we mentioned their names, and so we engaged people in questioning the performance of these MPs, and so we reinforced a little the accountability process. When it comes to accountability also, we made the members of parliament sign a pledge to endorse our comments on the draft law at then. And so 71 members of parliament, so the majority, signed, but still they did not commit to their pledge, to our pledge. I mean, to their pledge. And we also sent a lot of letters, and everything was made public, of course. And we used, for example, this was courageous in many ways. The speech of Parliament Speaker in Lebanon, who is Nabi Birri, when he was vowing to remove discrimination against women and provide protection for women. And so we used that speech in an advertisement also to send a reminder that, hey, we're still following you, and we hear what you're saying. And the third thing was like the direct mobilization, meaning, of course, contextual statements, protests, and sit-ins. Next, please. So here's an example of the campaigns I was talking about. One about at the first stage when we produced films, Silent Witness the celebrities, and then second, it's about name and shame tactics, and also exposing how the MPs were distorting the law to protect women. For example, about marital rape, we chose one of the most alarming changes that were introduced to the law, like marital rape and like the religious influence on the law, which we did not want. Next, please. This is an example about the accountability. As I was saying, we sent public letters and petitions to the MPs, and we exposed their signatures. And in the other visual, we used the Parliament Speaker's speech in an advertisement, and we hear the speech along with the names of the victims that died of family violence. And also we're asking where is the law, and that you have to convene for it, and it's a priority. Because there's always this argument that it's not a priority or it's a secondary issue, but for us it should be a priority regardless. And even if you have the electoral law to study, women's lives are not less important. Next, please. Also, this is part of the accountability tactic. Vote for us, we vote for you. And so this is the Red Thumb campaign, which won many awards, and people were very much engaged in it online and the social media, and the private sector alone was engaged. We did not ask anyone to engage with it, but it was like a personal initiative, and some people felt maybe a little embarrassed that if we do not show our support, then like we're not part of this, and we should be part of it because it was getting bigger media-wise and on the level of the society as a whole. Next. So in the previous picture, the red thumb was up, and then here the red thumb is down. And because the MPs did not vote for the law for the way they should have voted for, because they did not endorse the comments that they pledged to endorse. So people used the red thumb down to say that they will not vote for those who did not give full protection for women. And so also here we used their pictures in the same session after the voting session, and we stamped on their faces. Next. So this is an example of a direct mobilization in the street. It's March 8th, and you see that many people participated in this protest on Women's Day. It was 3 weeks before the approval of the law, and we engaged with families of the victims, of the women who died as a result of family violence, and they led this protest. And next. This is an example of the data and the documenting the cases of incidents of violence against women, and mostly femicide, because a lot of cases of violence against women, as you know, go unreported. And most of the cases that are reported to the media or to the police are cases of murder. And so here you can see how they cover the whole Lebanese territory. And documentation covers the years from 2010 until present. Next. The tactics here are a bit different, and so we moved from one phase to the other. We keep in mind our advocacy objective to amend the law to make it more effective, but at the same time we want to reinforce the implementation, the effective implementation, and also to increase knowledge about it. So our objectives were to simplify the text, the legal text of the law that was approved, and by this we made the language easier. We shared real stories of survivors and how they used the law. We published protection orders. We highlighted best practices in the judicial system. And here you play on the positive side, where you make judges feel like they're in a competition for doing good things, because we're actually acknowledging that, and we're publishing the protection orders which did not exist before. And I always stress on the fact that we work closely with the media because this has proved to be really important. The other tools, of course, in parallel, we work on trainings and producing materials. So we did work with internal security forces because we want the law to be implemented and we want them to do their job to protect women and respond to their complaints. We work with judges, with the social workers, with health workers, so with different stakeholders to sensitize different groups and also work on implementing the law. Next. So here's an example of how we made the text simple. We just used like a character. We created her to explain the law to women. Her name is Zalfa. She's a survivor of family violence. She went, filed a complaint, asked for a protection order, and so this was the easiest way to simplify the law, and she was a success. Next. She was on LBCI and on Future TV. And she was on the news time. Many people saw her, and this is also a film on the law which was screened in the movie theater and on television. It's also based on a real story. Next. Now, I assume that many of you saw this video. In parallel to our work on family violence, we work on changing the personal status laws in Lebanon. And so we used a lot of social experiments to also inform people about these laws and make them understand what these laws are actually about. So instead of just talking about articles and clauses and how they discriminate, what they do, blah, 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 we were like, okay, this is the law, this is how it looks like. And so it was much easier for people to grasp it and really be sensitized about it. And this is the child marriage video, which was a social experiment, which informed people about the personal status law that allow such marriages. Next. So to conclude, the people who are engaged in the process were women, victims or survivors of and families of the victims, the general public, the media, state institutions and officials, and of course various stakeholders. Next. Okay, I leave this for you to read. It's just an evaluation. Dr. Lina was saying that we should assess our campaigns and if they're really reaching people. So I think many of the objectives were reached. 97% of the Lebanese population heard of family violence through the media. 44% personally know someone subjected to family violence. 68% would interfere to help when witnessing a family violence case. 77% know of organizations that help victims, and 32% are aware of a law on family violence. So there is a lot of work to do, but I think the results are not bad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, for that great presentation, really. So please, colleague, let's do a round of applause for Maya. Thanks a lot for sharing with us a wide range of tactic and strategy, and also really explaining who should be involved in this process. It's very inspiring, and it gives a lot of food for thought for our influencing activities and strategy on ending IWSAW. So thanks. But now I'm opening the floor for 5 minutes to ask questions for Maya in relation to her presentation, and after we will have approximately 15 minutes for a question. We will open the floor for everyone to ask questions to all of the speakers. So we have a first question for you, Maya. It's a question from Mona. And her question is the following. A no pointing fingers positive approach was used in Asia, while name and shame approach was used in MENA. Do you think this is related to context and culture? Do you think the other approach would have worked in your region? So Maya, let me know if you want me to repeat, but this is the question of Mona. The floor is yours.
It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer about India whether this this approach would have worked, because of course, again, it depends on the context and on the stage we're at, and on the objective of the campaign. As I understood, the objective of the We Can campaign was to influence behavior, and also on an individual level. So the positive approach was needed here. While what we needed to do was to pressure members of parliament to approve the law. So it's a different objective, and it's a bit different. That's why I think there was a difference in the tactics. Yes.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks a lot. Actually, let me clarify. This was actually a question from Saria to both of you, to Maya and Mona. So Mona, when we open the floor, it would be really good if you could respond to that question. Maya, thanks a lot for this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Saria. I agree absolutely with what Maya is saying, that it's about different objectives. I think when you are trying to pressure the policymakers or the legislators, you might want to use diverse strategies. But when you want to kind of reach out to people in the communities, you want them to change themselves, their views, I think a positive approach works much better, because it doesn't make people defensive. So I think that's about how you choose strategies. The name and shame has been used in communities too, but again, pressure works up to a certain point, and that was one of the starting points of weekend, where we recognized that often women's groups are able to create a certain pressure within the community, but it does not necessarily change social attitudes. People still hold biases. The pressure might kind of, keep it for some time, but in terms of sustaining that change, transforming gender relations requires also a different approach. So I think that's kind of, but I would say that, yeah, these are we always should use multiple strategies and use what works best in the particular context.
Thank you very much, Mona. Thank you very much. So Maya, we have another question from you, from Christine. The question is the following. What links did you see between legislation and social norms? For instance, do you think the new legislation has helped to change social norms? Was implementation challenged by social norms that did not support or fit with the law? So Maya, the floor is yours.
Yes, I think the link is clear between the legislation and social norms, because at the end of the day, the legislation introduced change in the ways with which people deal with family violence. At first, for example, women were not as much encouraged to file complaints, because, for example, they would ask themselves, okay, so what next if I file a complaint and there are no protection mechanisms? So this encouraged to break the silence and to actually seek justice and even and going to the police and with different expectations, if I can say that. And also neighbors are more prone to calling the police. I mean, in the study we did, which I showed some results of it at the end. More than 55% said that they would report a family violence incident to the police. So it's more than half. And this, I think, I think is so it's changing the ways, the attitudes, and the ways with which people are dealing with family violence. It's no longer a private matter. I mean, it is still in some instances for as the study showed, for 1/3 they think it's a private matter, but 2/3 think that they should interfere. So they are affecting each other, the legislation and the social norms. I know the time ended. I just wanted to say that yes, implementation is still challenged by social norms, because of course you have police officers who are sexist or who do not respond well, and you do have judges who might have also patriarchal mentalities. So I think this is a challenge, and this will also take time. Thanks.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you very much. So now we'll open the floor for questions for each of the 3 speakers, and also please, as speakers, feel free to also raise your hand and ask questions to colleagues. Also, for the participant, if you feel about sharing experience from your countries and from your region, please feel free. Being conscious of the time, we will have a 10-minute Q&A session. We'll run a little bit late, so it's for that we reduce the time. So please feel free to either write your question in the chat box, or for those who cannot write in the chat box, please raise your hand and we will open your mic. We'll open your mic for you to ask your question directly. And for those who want to share the experience from your region, we will also open your mic. So please just raise your hand and let us know. I have so in the meantime that everyone is typing question if they want to have question. I have a question for Dr. Lina. I wanted to know if you have good example of programming and also influencing work to end violence against women that engage with the private sectors.
Thank you.
Dr. Lina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, I don't have a lot. I do have some that I've seen in places like Haiti, for instance, engaging with the telephone company, for instance, to send mass text messages to people to alert them to support services, where is the nearest hospital, messaging like to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, humanitarian aid is free, please don't do anything in order to receive it. If this situation should arise, call so-and-so. So things like that I have seen. Phone companies are a good outlet, and any media, obviously, is great. I haven't seen as much as I would like. That's really the first one that comes to mind. I'd love to hear more, and I'd love collectively to find strategies to be able to engage the private sector in a real way, not a knee-jerk kind of way, not a corporate social responsibility for the organization's good PR, but genuine interest and commitment, I think, would be fantastic. One way I've seen, for instance, with mining and extractive industries is, like in Papua New Guinea, their concern is that they generate men who have more resources, who are mobile, who then are more likely to pay for sex, so it increases the number of prostitutes that are providing services for the miners. So then what is it incumbent upon these mining companies, for example, to work on prevention, to support women, to create maybe zero tolerance policies and embed something in their human resources, protocols and procedures. I've seen a little bit of that, but that's generally reactive because they're trying to avoid the problem that, in a way, they've already created. I wish I had better ideas, but I'd love to hear from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lina. So I don't know if anyone of the participants has some example of good practice in relation to that they would like to share. So we're just waiting for you to ask to write question in the chat box. If not, we will be proceeding to the closing. But I have a last question then from my side, and sorry, it's again for you, Dr. Lina. It's now we will have the World Humanitarian Summit at the end of the month, and so I wanted to know what is at stake for GBV or ending violence against women. What is at stake in that discussion? The floor is yours.
That's a great question, and unfortunately I won't be attending, but I'll be watching very closely. I'm interested in the ways in which humanitarian actors are going to firstly look at longer-term support and sustaining gains, so not providing this massive influx of aid, human and financial resources that then disappears immediately after the emergency, because that creates this big void, this vacuum that we were talking about earlier. Something that looks at longer-term support, because that's going to enable us to address gender-based violence in a more effective way. Because if you think about in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, everybody coming in, talking about GBV response, and we're all scrambling around trying to do what we can, and then 6 months later, all of that support has disappeared. And that's not, GBV doesn't work that way. It doesn't work in line with an emergency schedule, if you will, because it's a constant state. There are different forms, they're magnified at different times, but in the longer term after an emergency, intimate partner violence is something that increases. So then why would we disappear when there are also forms of violence that appear 6 and 12 months out? So I think the idea is for the humanitarian summit in general, they're talking about the actors that might look at longer-term support, and that's going to be a good entry point for GBV. At the same time, we're also looking at coordinating mechanisms and global movements like the call to action, and that's something that's also going to raise voices and increase the leverage of GBV prevention and response movements, because those are collective, they're multi-government commitments, they are global in their reach, their leadership is rotating, so countries have an incentive to continue to support it. That's something also that's going to be on the agenda. That's just a start. Back to you, Julie.
Hi, Saria. Are you still on?
Hello, everybody. The connection, we had a very bad connection problem. I see that most of you have left the room, but for recording purposes, we will proceed to close the session. So thank you everybody for your participation and for your interesting questions. A big round of applause to our speakers. We hope you found this discussion interesting and informative. As explained, the session is being recorded. It will be posted online along with an Arabic interpretation. For those who would like, we will send out the links once posted on Policy and Practice. In the chat box, we have shared some interesting reports with you. Please feel free to save them. We also shared with you the contacts of the speakers. You can for you to contact them directly. Let us know what you think. We are going to share with you now a survey that we have created to get your feedback in order to enhance and improve our program, as we have mentioned earlier. So here I will share it with you. Please please kindly fill it out. So thanks a lot for your participation, and thanks again for the speakers. Apologies again for losing the session at the very end. Session is over.